Welcome, everybody. Good morning, good evening, good day. Thank you for joining us today from wherever you are. It's wonderful to spend this morning or evening or throughout the day with you. My name is René Moussai. I'm the Senior Curator and Head of Curatorial and Collection at Autograph in London. It is my pleasure to introduce today's talk, which forms part of the International Season of Photo Life, which is presented in partnership with Photo Australia and Photo 2022, the forthcoming International Festival of Photography in Melbourne. Photo Life is supported by the British Council as part of the UK-Australia season 2021-22, which is a collaboration between the British Council and the Australian government's Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. And Autograph's work is supported using public funding by the Arts Council England. The idea behind this collaborative series of talks is to facilitate a creative, intellectual, artistic exchange between artists and curators based here in the UK and in Australia. Hence, for each of the talks, an artist from one country is in conversation with a curator from the other country. The series overall comprises 10 online conversations that explore, through engaged and open dialogues, a range of pertinent ideas around image making in relation to matters of identity and diaspora, history, culture, memory, post and decoloniality, if you will, difference or different conditions of existence, etc. Importantly, these conversations are framed within the context of human rights, representation, and social justice. As such, the program foregrounds the importance of centering Black, Brown, Indigenous, feminist, queer, and other crucial voices and modes of storytelling in photography and lens-based media. The 5 British artists selected for the program are all featured in our current group exhibition at Autograph, which is entitled Care, Contagion, Community, Self and Other. And should you find yourself in town in the coming months, please do come and visit. We'd love to welcome you at the gallery. Today's talk will last about 45 minutes. Feel free to leave questions at any point during the talk, and you may use the Q&A function in the chat to do so. And if you would like to access captions, please click on the closed caption function and select subtitles. This is an ongoing program that began last month and will run until the end of this month. So please also join us for next week's talks, which will feature the artists Ying Ang and Mohina Chandra. And so for today's session, we are joined by, sorry, something weird technical just happened. I hope everybody can hear me okay. So for this session, we are joined by artist Sonal Kantaria and Torika Bolatagici, both visual artists as well as curators. Sonal Kantaria is a London-based British Indian visual artist whose research-led interdisciplinary practice explores themes of movement, settlement, and cultural identity. Sonal is a wonderful critical visual thinker and maker who I've had the great pleasure of working with and knowing for many years, who engages often very personally with matters of history, trauma, and memory, investigating different forms of resistance through photography, film, and video, and text. Her work is deeply concerned with politics of representation. I'm thinking here of her careful and sensitive portrayal of elderly residents in care homes, for example, gently but powerfully probing in this particular series intersections around isolation, migration, age, aging, but also a body of work that I often remember and return to are her remarkable Polaroid photographs of young Indian and Bangladeshi women caught in a web of human trafficking. And a series that also highlighted very powerfully questions around women's rights and gender-based violence, and of course her ongoing collaborative work with Indigenous communities in Western Australia. Past exhibitions include the Magenta Foundation in Toronto, the Delhi Photo Festival, Perth Centre of Photography, Icon Gallery and Whitechapel in London. I could go on amongst many others, and her work is held in several public and private collections, including in Australia, as well as the Government Art Collection in the UK. And Sonal is also currently pursuing her practice-based PhD in film studies at King's College. Torika Bolatagici, we haven't met yet. It's a pleasure to meet you here today. I'm really looking forward to hearing your thoughts. She is a Fijian Australian artist and educator who produces multidisciplinary research-led projects. So there's a lot of overlap with Sonal's practice. I think both of you are educators working in the academy, as well as practicing visual artists. And Torika's work also foregrounds the counter-narratives of marginalized histories and embodied knowledges through curatorial collaboration, installation, publication, working also with photography and video, investigating the tensions and intersections between gender, commodification, migration, globalization, for example, through initiatives such as the Pacific Photo Book Project or the Community Reading Room, which foster life-affirming spaces for creative communities of color. Torika's work has also been exhibited internationally, and she holds a PhD from the School of Art and Design at the University of New South Wales, and is currently course director and senior lecturer in photography at the Deakin University in Melbourne. I, for my part, am very much looking forward to your dialogue today, and I will now hand over to Torika. Thank you both so much for taking part.
Thank you so much, Renee. What a wonderful introduction. Lovely to meet you. I would like to begin by acknowledging you that I'm joining from the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri and Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation. And I offer my deepest respects to the elders, past and present. And I'd also like to acknowledge any First Nations people who are joining us this evening. I should also note that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people should be aware that this presentation may contain the images and names of people who have passed away. Sonal, it's so lovely to be in conversation with you this evening. Welcome.
Thanks, Torika. Yeah, I'm looking forward to our chat. Thank you.
We have a lot of works that we're going to discuss this evening, but I thought it might be best to start with the work that you have been commissioned for Autograph, called Gar, which you made last year in 2020. And I wanted to start by reading a quote from a response. It's this beautiful poetic response to your work that was written by Lola Young, and she says, "They say people and their emotions are as ephemeral as clouds. Birds know better than people what make clouds so satisfying to observe. Trees would like us to know their views about them, but we do not want to listen." And it is a beautiful, beautiful response to your work. And I just thought it really kind of sums up, I think, the way you work and your sensitivity and the way that you listen and respond to people and to landscapes. And so I wanted to ask you about the work that you made called Gar and how that came about, because it was a very sort of a cyclical kind of movement back to where you grew up.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Torika. So I just wanted to kind of actually start by saying thank you to Autograph for this wonderful commissioner and for their support over the past kind of 10 years or so, a long-standing kind of working relationship with Autograph. But also thank you to kind of Photo Australia for this opportunity, and of course Renee for the introduction, and I'm very much looking forward to our talk. I also just wanted to make my acknowledgements to country, to Yamaji country, where I've been working for the past kind of 7 years or so, working with elders past and present. So yeah, just to make those kind of acknowledgements. But yes, in kind of response to your question, Torika, yes, certainly this kind of work brought me back home. So for the past 7-8 years, I've been working in Australia and predominantly on kind of Yamaji country. And my work has very much kind of been focused on that particular kind of space, and looking at kind of histories, narratives of the landscape, but also narratives that the elders have kind of shared with me, to work on collaborative kind of film and photography work, which I'll talk about kind of later. But this was at a point where you know, there was a stillness that was kind of embodied in my own kind of being and my own kind of practice, really through lockdown and not being able to kind of travel. So for a very long time, my work has been placed kind of in other territories. And really, when this kind of commission came about and was offered by Autograph, it placed me back home. And Gar means home in Gujarati, which is my first kind of language. So at the time, I was actually living at, I was back in my family home. I was in Hertfordshire, a place where I grew up, had my schooling, etc. And I was kind of really thinking about the theme of kind of care, but also the BAME community in in the UK, so Black, Asian, minority, ethnic, for those of you who are not familiar with that term, and how the impact of kind of COVID was affecting kind of the community. And that really made me kind of think about care on a kind of a larger scale, but also care in a family kind of sense, care for the landscape, etc. And this commission became very kind of a piece of a real kind of introspective body of work for me. So I was thinking about my relationship to kind of my immediate space, my immediate kind of landscape. I'm just going to kind of share my screen so I can show you some images from the commission. Hopefully you can see that first image there. So this is a landscape which is about a 15-minute walk away from my family kind of home, and it was a place that I was kind of returning to on a daily basis, perhaps twice a day, a large kind of expansive space, not dissimilar really to the types of kind of landscapes that I've experienced in kind of Western Australia in some senses as well. So it became this kind of meditative space for me, but I was also thinking about the layering of those kind of landscapes. So if I just go on to kind of show you a number of images here from the exhibition on a kind of autograph at the moment, each of these photographs is, I say layered because I'm thinking about kind of my own cultural history during this period as well. So each of the photographs takes on a name, a particular word, again in kind of Gujarati, my first language. But I'm thinking about the kind of the English landscape and the kind of the cultural kind of layering that goes on top of that, which is again an aspect that I've been thinking about in kind of Western Australia. So from this commission came a number of photographic works, but also 3 short films. And for the short films, I was using Sanskrit voiceover and layering that over kind of the image as well. So yeah, again, kind of just really thinking about kind of the cultural impact of kind of communities on particular kind of landscapes, and that's really how my kind of thinking started into this kind of body of work.
It had been a while since you'd made work in the UK, my understanding is, and so I'm just wondering if that experience of working for such a long time on Yamatji country actually kind of changed your own relationship and your feeling about, you know, the landscape and the environment that you grew up in.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you know, starting off my kind of practice, I was, and I still kind of, I'm still very much kind of interested in portraiture and kind of representation. But when I first started kind of collaborating on Yamatji country with elders there, I was very much thinking about those histories of those particular kind of landscapes and the narratives of those landscapes. So viewing those histories post colonization, again with that, you know, this theme of kind of doubling the or multiple, like these multiple kind of histories that exist, thinking about that in kind of Western Australia, and that kind of becoming the focus and the start of kind of discussion of working with elders out there. So certainly those kind of narratives of those landscapes, which are very kind of pertinent to the collaborative work that we've been doing on Yamatji country, I started to kind of think about the landscape in my own kind of landscape of where I've grown up and what is home for me, and what is kind of belonging for me as well. So the work out there has very much kind of informed this particular commission, I would say.
Yeah, and also it was made during a period of lockdown and isolation in various forms. The production of the work itself, you usually work in medium format, film. So was it, this work was produced digitally?
It was, yeah, absolutely. And you're right. Again, there's for kind of pretty much the entirety of my career, I've worked with film, physical kind of film, medium format film, or kind of in the case of some of the short films I've been working with, making with the elders, certainly using kind of Super 8 film. And that's something that kind of gives me time to kind of reflect the time that it takes to kind of process a film, perhaps digitize the film, could be kind of, in the case of Super 8, a number of kind of months, by which time we've kind of left this particular kind of landscape and very much kind of returned to the kind of the town or the city. It could be Geraldton or it could be Perth, etc. And whereby this physical film makes this kind of journey, in most cases, back to kind of the UK, and then kind of comes back to me. So I'm thinking about that from a kind of a theoretical kind of perspective as well, just again kind of going back to my work in Australia, how these stories kind of make, how the film has made that kind of journey, but how these stories kind of make those journeys as well. So when I started to collaborate with the elders, it was really important for all of us that the work come back to the UK, given the histories of kind of colonization that are being kind of discussed, and for kind of the work to be shown here as well. So yeah, using that film, the film making its journey, the narratives making their journeys as well, have become a very important kind of part of my practice as well. So yeah, this was one of the first times that I was kind of going back to, well, or using kind of digital formats, simply because everything was kind of closed down, so labs were not open, etc., and didn't have the luxury of kind of time really to develop, physically kind of develop those films, etc. So it was a different, I suppose it was a different kind of format, but my thought process was very much similar to how I shoot kind of film as well.
Yeah. I was wondering if we could cycle back to one of your earlier series. And it was, I feel like it was a different kind of moment in your storytelling journey. And that's the series Nasi Trafficked, which Renee referred to in the opening. And I've seen some of this series online, and I didn't actually realize that they were a series of Polaroids. I wonder if you could tell us a bit about this series and how it came about.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is the body of work that was undertaken in 2010. It was the end of my MA. I remember reading an article on human trafficking into prostitution, and it was something that kind of really moved me. And then I decided that I wanted to kind of research the topic further, but actually undertake the body of work in India, where the problem is at its kind of largest, and Bombay being a hub for both domestic and international kind of trafficking as well. And also, my background is also Indian as well, and so it was an area that I wanted to kind of go and explore further. And so I started to work with an NGO out there, the Rescue Foundation, a brilliant NGO that work with girls and women who have been trafficked and rescue those rescue those people, house them, educate them, feed them, etc. And eventually, after a process of after a legal process, the girls are kind of free to, or the women are free to kind of leave that protective kind of space. So again, this element of care is something that is a thread that runs throughout my practice, I would say. But I was really, again, I was interested in the post, you know, the post event. So you know, my background is actually in kind of photojournalism, so my MA was undertaken in kind of photojournalism. But even at that point, I was not particularly interested in the event itself, but rather the aftermath of the event. And this was certainly the case for kind of Naseeb traffic. So for over a 6-week period, I worked with girls and women who were in the protective care of kind of the NGO, and who were happy to have their stories kind of told, their faces shown, etc., and who were survivors rather than kind of victims, and very much saw themselves in that way as well. From this series, there was a number of Polaroids, and also triptychs, and kind of a short film that kind of came out of this body of work, and was exhibited here in London by Autograph as well. So that was my first solo exhibition with Autograph as well. And so the Polaroids, again, were kind of very, for me, very personal objects as well. You know, one Polaroid would be given to the person who I photographed, the girls or women who I kind of photographed. One Polaroid was kept for myself, and it was a Polaroid that were kind of exhibited with Autograph back in 2012 at the exhibition there, and they became, yeah, personal, kind of intimate, like, objects, but also also kind of objects where the you know, the girls had their own kind of copies of which as well, and where they stand kind of bravely facing the camera as I say, as kind of survivors as well. So yeah, this body of work is still kind of really kind of resonates, and it's something I kind of think about a lot, really.
I think that sort of that sensitivity in the way that you work in you know, sharing images immediately with the people that you photographed. You've spoken about that being a really important part of your process in more recent works, where there's this sort of agency that, you know, where you will confer with the people and, you know, make sure that they are, you know, comfortable with the images that are going to be shared, and giving them copies. And I think that sort of marks such a shift from, you know, from quite standard kind of photojournalism. And I wonder how you kind of feel about the limits of photojournalism as a kind of a methodology and a way of making and storytelling, and if that has sort of, if you're thinking about that, has sort of shifted over time through your practice.
Yeah, I think it kind of I think really it shifted whilst I was undertaking my MA, and I was thinking about perhaps about issues I was interested in, or social, political, historical kind of issues in a more kind of conceptual way. As with kind of Naseeb traffic, also the, you know, the aftermath, the post event, rather than the event itself. And I think that has kind of continued. There was also this, for me, this shift during that year from using kind of using solely photography to experimenting with kind of film as well. And that is something that has kind of continued in, you know, in my practice. But certainly, you know, there has been a long-standing kind of history of people of color, of kind of being, like, communities, etc., being kind of represented. And it's really important for me to work in a kind of a more collaborative way, rather than in a more kind of rather than kind of thinking about power dynamics, etc., but rather working in a more kind of collaborative way. I really like the phrase, you know, sitting with, rather than, you know, again, kind of these kind of power dynamics that have existed kind of historically. So kind of moving away from that. With the elders that I've been working with, they have, you know, they've very much kind of led their stories, their kind of narratives. They've shared the stories that they want to kind of share. We've gone to the landscapes that they've wanted to kind of introduce, etc. I've asked them what they would like the film to be called. I've shown them kind of edits of the work itself, and it's only with that, if they're kind of happy with that kind of representation, that the work goes any further. And that is really kind of important for me, as I say, because of this long-standing history of being kind of represented.
Yeah, absolutely. And the work Who Cares, which you made in 2012, was another collaboration. So there was a photographer and a writer, and that series was about culturally specific aged care homes. I wonder if you could talk about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is a body of work that I was kind of working on for kind of a year or so, and the care home that I was actually visiting was in the Midlands, so it's in Leicester, which is kind of a couple of hours away from London. So I was working on that over kind of a longer period of time, simply because it wasn't in the same city where I was kind of living. But I was really kind of thinking about the shift of kind of cultural values. So the actual care home that I started to kind of work with was specifically for kind of South Asian residents, and in thinking about these kind of shifting kind of cultural values, where the elderly are kind of cared for at the family home or at the extended kind of family home, there was this, you know, there was this kind of new, I suppose this kind of new phenomenon of the elderly kind of going to a care home. And I was thinking about kind of my own grandparents at the time and where they were living, and, you know, living with kind of extended family, etc. But how kind of care also performs in our own kind of communities as well. It was many of the residents whom I spoke with there, you know, they had kind of cared for their own mothers, grandparents, mother-in-laws, father-in-laws, etc. And so this was almost kind of alien to them. But you know, but being in a care home was kind of alien to them. But also it was something that was I suppose kind of linked to, again, kind of like being in the UK, having this shift of kind of cultural values. You know, perhaps the people who would normally kind of be looking after the elders in the home would also kind of be working, etc. So, you know, there would be no other choice than having the elderly in kind of care homes. But I think it kind of really raises questions of how we look after our elderly in kind of society, and kind of what that means to us. And it was this work that was published in this in a newspaper type publication by Autograph. This is in 2012, and also the work of another photographer who had worked on kind of a similar body of work.
And Yasmin Gunatatnam wrote an essay that accompanied the photos, and there's a part here where she talks about the documentation that's captured as being captured with dignity and empathy, a kind of care work done with the camera. And I thought that just really speaks to the way that you work. And I wonder if this work has kind of taken on a new resonance in, you know, given the impact of BAME on BAME communities during the pandemic. And I read an interview where you talk about, you know, kind of asking the question, you know, who cares and who is cared for.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you know, it's really this work that has almost kind of linked back to the recent commission with Autograph on Asian community. You know, this was the last body of work that I did in the UK, and very much kind of reflecting on my own kind of community. And then, you know, the next one was Asian community last year. So in a way, the work has kind of come full circle, and it's certainly something that's an area that I want to kind of explore further. You know, my own kind of cultural background of, you know, my family's kind of movement from India to Kenya to kind of the UK, and what that kind of cultural space means, or what it means to be British Indian in the UK right now. Thinking about our kind of histories and that kind of that movement that you know, that many families have kind of experienced, either directly from kind of the South Asia, or you know, via kind of East Africa, which is an area that's present in my own kind of family history, or kind of other areas. And that was a real kind of history that I was interested in exploring in Australia as well, with the body of work Traces.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that. So you arrived in a residency, was it 2013?
2013, yeah, absolutely, yeah.
And how did you make these connections with Indian diaspora when you were in Western Australia, and then you travelled throughout other parts of Australia and continued that series?
Yeah, that's right. So initially I was invited to show and receive traffic for Perth Arts Festival with PCP, Perth Centre Photography, and this was back in 2013, and I actually kind of undertook an artist residency with PCP during that time to really kind of think about the Indian diaspora in Australia. So, you know, I was interested in looking at other people's kind of experiences via my own kind of experience of being British Indian, and how other people had kind of experienced Australia, where they were kind of coming from, where what their kind of journeys had been, what their present kind of situations were, etc. So I started to kind of work with community groups, with religious institutions, etc., and really kind of going along there to these different kind of spaces in Perth at the time. That's where I started the body of work, to meet people there. And it was really when this kind of connection was formed that, you know, we'd meet and on a number of occasions before actually kind of photographing as well. So the portrait that kind of sits on the left is paired with a landscape on the right, and this is Sigrid from the series Traces. So each person photographed would select where they want to kind of be photographed. And then I would kind of eventually make that pairing, but it was very much based on this kind of connection, and this connection that was formed. The work then took me to kind of Melbourne, and then eventually to kind of Sydney as well. But it was again, this was kind of really coming from thinking again about my own kind of cultural background here, and exploring that with other people that I had kind of worked with eventually in this kind of series as well.
And you can see that that sort of sensitivity that you that you portray in your portraits, but also in the way that you make these portraits of space and landscape as well. How did that kind of shift your sense of diaspora and your own identity and sense of belonging?
Yeah, I think you know, so many of the people that I kind of worked with had migrated from other territories. So it, you know, again, it could have been the subcontinent or Malaysia, Singapore, East Africa, South Africa, etc. to for kind of opportunity and to make kind of better lives for themselves in Australia, and having the opportunity to kind of do so. I thought it was really interesting that when I started kind of working on this project, I remember going to kind of the Perth Gurdwara, and one of the people that I was kind of speaking to at the Gurdwara, an elderly Sikh man, was kind of telling me that he had been invited over to Australia to work as an engineer during the Australia-wide kind of policy during this kind of period, but also the difficulty in which that movement kind of took place. There wasn't a kind of a community, an established kind of community there at that time. There were no, it was very hard to get hold of certain kind of ingredients, he was telling me. You know, things would have to be kind of shipped back and forth from Australia as well. But I found this real kind of sense of community in Perth, and I felt very kind of embraced by that community. Perhaps because it's kind of a smaller community than what I'm kind of used to in the kind of UK, and certainly a smaller community than in Melbourne as well. But there was kind of real kind of interest in telling these stories and wanting to be part of this kind of body of work as well. And the same was true of kind of Melbourne and of Sydney. You know, other people I met, such as kind of Sigrid, who I'll just go back to here, were, you know, born in Perth, live in her case, you know, still like lives in Perth. And so that was kind of, you know, almost like similar to my own kind of situation, being born here, living here, etc. But you know, having dual cultures, or maybe kind of multiple kind of cultures in one's own kind of background. So this really kind of came from kind of conversation and a sharing of experiences, which is something that has kind of continued through the work of working with the elders on Yamaji country as well. This idea of kind of sharing, of collaborating, of sharing a particular kind of space, and of trust as well. So, you know, these relationships that have kind of built have certainly kind of continued and do continue.
Yeah, let's talk about, I mean, Perth, Western Australia has sort of become a second home to you, and you've worked for such a long period of time. Let's move to that series now. And there are a number of bodies of work that comprise, and it's ongoing, isn't it? Tell us about, you know, how this kind of, how it started, and then the background to this work, The Fox and the Snake.
Yeah, sure, thank you. So it is a large kind of body of work, and I'm just showing a couple of examples here. It is also kind of an ongoing body of work. But this again kind of started towards the end of 2013, when I met Gordon Gray, who is an elder who's living on Yamaji country, and we met with the idea of, again, telling these kind of narratives of the landscape, of being kind of led by the landscape. Gordon himself was also kind of working on a kind of another project on songlines in the area. And so we decided to start kind of, he invited me to Geraldton, and we started to kind of work together. So this very first landscape that we experienced together was at Granite Flats, which lies pretty close to about 20 kilometres away from Geraldton in the Midwest of Western Australia. And Gordon was water divining there and working on this project on kind of songlines. But the very, the very first thing we kind of experienced there was this dying fox, which is the one that you can see on the left-hand side here, which he thought had kind of been caught in a trap by farmers. He decided to kind of put the fox out of its misery. It was dying at the time. We were then kind of trying to work out what happened, walked up the mound and found this king brown kind of snake with, again, its head severed and these ants kind of feeding off the snake. And this was, this was really kind of a very strong start to this kind of project, this, almost this kind of battle between an introduced kind of species and a native, animal. So the battle between kind of the two, which was on a landscape of trauma, but also a landscape which was a former camping ground by the local kind of community there as well. And it, this was at the end of 2013, and it's, these images very much kind of stay in my mind. And when I came back to London, really invited me to kind of delve further into the work that I'd kind of been doing out on kind of Yamaji country with the elders, and to kind of explore that work further. So, I mean, I've been thinking about, again, being led by the narratives of the landscape and what that kind of means, and very much trusting these kind of feelings or phenomenology of being on the landscape and the experiences of being on these particular kind of sites of significance. But also, again, what is laid on the landscape, that which we cannot kind of see, or that which is not kind of visible. These kind of laid histories of colonial kind of violence, but post kind of colonization, but pre-colonization, these spaces had a completely different kind of history, and these are oral histories which which by their very nature are not kind of written down, but have been shared by the elders with whom I've kind of been working with, and who wanted to kind of share those stories for those stories to be kind of commemorated in some way.
Yeah, and you've talked about this kind of sense of urgency, to make this work, but then to have to kind of continue at such a distance, it sort of increases that sense of urgency. You've talked about your first sort of experiences on country, and that that feeling of being led by trust. But also this sense of kind of like a hypersensitivity. And I just want to return to that in all of your work, because I think it's really what defines these threads of care, is the way that you kind of deal with these traumatic stories. Every one of the stories of migration, of trafficking, of care homes. There's this resonance of violence and trauma, but there is, I think, what is really strikes me in your work is your sensitivity and the way that you listen, and I think that it really speaks to that care and the methodology and the way that you work. Before we finish up, Sonal, I wanted to ask about your most recent commission, which I think is happening at the moment as part of the British Council UK Australia season. Did you want to tell us a little bit about that before we finish up? Yeah,
sure. So just kind of going back to your kind of comments, thank you, about care. And one kind of particular aspect I wanted to just touch on briefly was this idea of kind of stillness, like a stillness that I suppose is kind of linked to to listening and being kind of hyper aware. So it's a stillness that most recently I've experienced during lockdown, because we're physically unable, and I'm sure many people on this call are also kind of perhaps experiencing it right now as well. But this we're kind of so used to kind of moving around or traveling around, and suddenly we're put in a situation whereby we're not able to kind of do that, and it forces us to be still, and it forces us to be kind of very aware and kind of hyper aware, however we choose to kind of do that, whether it's through listening to kind of news reports or kind of being introspective and reflecting on our lives or our past year or whatever that is. And certainly it kind of led me to kind of do so most recently during the various kind of lockdowns that we've had in the UK here. So the last time that I was in Australia was in 2019, and I was working on country with Gordon, and then I was kind of led back to the UK on something that was kind of very, very urgent. So my journey was kind of cut short in a sense, but that stillness that I've experienced on the particular kind of landscapes of being, hyper aware is something that I have. It's something that I've kind of had to become attuned to in a sense. So, perhaps like traveling from Geraldton up to, up to kind of Wiluna, which is on the edge of kind of the Western Desert, which is this, huge expansive kind of space, and we wouldn't be making that journey in kind of one go. It would be over a number of kind of days, but absolutely kind of camping out and being aware of what is around you, being aware of those particular sounds, being trusting of kind of the landscape to take care of you, following those kind of cultural protocols, etc., so that you are kind of you are respecting the landscape, and in turn you are being kind of looked after by that kind of landscape as well. That has also been a very kind of important part of my process. I think being on country allows you to be still and to stop completely, and also realizing that we're already kind of a tiny speck in this kind of expansive space, and we're at the mercy of anything that is kind of around us in that space. So it's certainly kind of been a very humbling experience, and that is that same kind of stillness that I feel that I'm sure many others have experienced during lockdown, and being hyper aware in a kind of a different sense here. Yeah.
Can you just show us quickly the black and white, the infrared series?
Yeah, sure. So this is again a body of work that I started back in 2019. Experimenting with kind of infrared film, which I'd never, again, kind of medium format, but I'd never worked with kind of infrared, and I was just really interested on I was kind of really interested how this would kind of translate. I mean, all of the work that I've been doing out in Australia has encompassed kind of colour, because colour has been a big kind of aspect of those kind of landscapes that I'm experiencing. But again, in relation to kind of being hyper aware, moving through these expansive kind of spaces, you're aware of like the color of like the earth changing, or the nature of the bush, or the particular kind of trees, etc., and the change of kind of colors, etc. I mean, I'm just going to show you a couple of images from Yerda, which is a new film that I've made in collaboration with Gordon Gray, and this is using kind of Super 8 film. So absolutely, kind of colour has been a huge kind of aspect of working on kind of country. But yeah, I was really kind of interested in kind of experiencing this landscape in black and white after I'd kind of known this landscape for, you know, a period of kind of 7 years or so, and seeing what kind of effect that has on me, you know, almost kind of pairing everything kind of back and seeing it in, you know, like monochrome, etc. And I think it kind of presents this, for me, it kind of presents a view of a very kind of, I look at these images in a very different way to how I look at kind of the images of like the fox and the snake, for example. As I say, it's very much kind of paired back for me. But also a landscape that I have kind of become familiar with, and perhaps have almost this kind of duality between kind of being in the UK and being in kind of and being in kind of Australia, and what that idea of kind of belonging means through these particular kind of images. And, you know, from the beginning of the presentation where you showed us the images of from Gar, it's you know, there's such a beautiful relationship between these images. I remember you telling me that you know, when you showed someone those images from your home in the UK, that they actually thought that they had been taken in Western Australia. So there's obviously this kind of this resonance and these traces. I think in the way that the landscape that you have encountered in Australia is shifting the way you see your own landscape, and it's incredible to see in this kind of cycle. Yeah, and it's interesting because I really think the work that I've been doing out in Australia with the elders has brought me back home in a sense, and has kind of shown me what home is and what home kind of means to me over this long kind of period of time. I mean, right now I'm actually working on for the UK Australia British Council UK Australia season. I'm working on kind of a short film featuring 3 female elders who I've worked with out on Yamatji country, Yamatji elders, and so, you know, since I'm not able to kind of travel and collaborate with them at the moment, I'm using kind of footage from a number of kind of years ago. So though I'm not kind of physically in Australia, my work is still very kind of connected. But you know, the commission with Autograph has very much kind of placed me back home, and that's something that I want to kind of explore further as time goes on. I feel like we could talk for hours, and we have. Thank you so much, Sonal, for sharing your work and this incredible, you know, rich insight into your practice and your thinking. It's been really amazing to be in conversation with you. Thank you. And thank you, everybody, for joining us tonight.